The night sky was the color of dying embers, heavy with smoke that rolled from the far ridge like a slow storm. The wind carried the scent of burnt sage and scorched timber across the plains, whispering through the half-collapsed fences of a forgotten ranch on the edge of an old American village. Beneath that dim red horizon, a young woman stood barefoot in the dust, clutching a rusty lantern as if the light inside could still hold back the ruins spreading across the land. Her dress was torn from travel, her hair tangled with ash, and her eyes, wide and searching, looked not at the fire but at the wooden cage behind the barn. Inside that cage, chained by the wrists and covered in dust, sat an Apache warrior, silent as stone, his face half hidden by shadow. The villagers had dragged him there at dawn, claiming he'd led the attacks that burned the neighboring settlements. They said he was a murderer, a savage, a threat to every soul west of the river. But the woman had seen something else in his eyes when the sheriff's men threw him down, a kind of stillness that wasn't hatred, but pain. And that look haunted her long after the others had gone home. While the rest of the town prayed for rain and cursed the war between settlers and tribes, she found herself standing in front of that cage night after night, unsure if she was driven by fear or something far deeper. The moon rose pale over the desert hills, lighting the man's wrists where the iron cut into his skin. He hadn't spoken since his capture, not once. His silence made the townsfolk uneasy. They were used to men who begged, cursed, or bartered for mercy. But this one simply watched, his eyes dark as river stones, his breath steady even when the sheriff's men laughed and called him a ghost who forgot how to die. The woman's father had fought in the border wars years ago, and she'd grown up hearing stories about Apache raids, the way they moved through canyons like smoke, the way they vanished before sunrise. Yet now, standing before one of them, she couldn't see a monster. She saw a man who looked more like a wounded hawk, caught but not broken. All day, she tried to busy herself with the village chores, fetching water, feeding the livestock, sewing the torn curtains in the church. But every time the wind blew from the hills carrying the faint sound of chains rattling, her heart stirred. She didn't understand why, but something inside her refused to accept the story told by the men who sat in the saloon, drunk on their victory. They said the Apache deserved to hang by dawn. The preacher said justice demanded it. Even her neighbors whispered that the world would never be safe until every tribe was driven out. Yet when she looked at the cage, all she saw was a human being left to die in a world already turning to ash. By evening, the sky grew darker, the clouds thick with smoke from a distant wildfire. The villagers closed their doors, fearing the wind might bring the flames their way. That night, the woman could no longer stay inside. She wrapped herself in a shawl, took her lantern, and walked out to the barn. The boards creaked under her feet, and the dry grass whispered against her skirt. When she reached the cage, the Apache turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. Neither spoke. For a long moment, only the sound of the wind filled the air. Then, almost without thinking, she knelt beside the cage and whispered, "They'll hang you at sunrise." He didn't move, but his gaze softened just enough for her to see the depth of his exhaustion. She set the lantern down and studied the lock. It was old, its metal eaten by rust. Her hands trembled as she reached for the small key she'd taken from the sheriff's desk hours earlier, her mind still echoing with doubt. She knew what freeing him would mean, betraying the town, her people, and everything she'd been taught to believe. Yet something stronger than fear guided her now, something that told her the world wasn't as simple as good and evil. The key turned, with a heavy click. The sound was louder than she expected. Her breath caught as the Apache rose slowly, the chain slipping from his wrists. He stood taller than she imagined, his shoulders broad, his movements silent. For a heartbeat, she thought he might strike her down or run into the night without a word. Instead, he paused, his gaze drifting to the open fields glowing faintly under the moonlight. The air between them felt alive, charged with something dangerous and sacred all at once. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. A red glow flickered on the horizon where the wildfire crept closer to the village. She whispered, "Go," before someone sees. But he didn't move. His eyes searched hers as if trying to understand why she had done this. Finally, in a low, rough voice, he asked, "Why?" She hesitated, her throat tight. "Because I couldn't let them kill another man while the world's already burning." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped out of the cage. The ground seemed to tremble under the weight of his silence. The woman backed away, unsure if she'd just saved a life or unleashed something she couldn't control. As he passed her, he stopped and looked toward the burning hills. His face caught the light of the lantern, revealing a scar that ran from his jaw to his temple, an old wound, long healed. He turned back to her and said, You should leave this place. Fire comes fast. Before she could answer, a distant gunshot echoed from the ridge. Then another. The night that had been quiet moments ago filled with the sounds of horses, shouting, and the faint thud of hooves. The villagers had seen the glow too. Panic spread through the valley. The Apache looked at her once more, then reached for her hand. Not with violence, but with the desperate certainty of someone who knew the end was near. His touch was warm, steady, and human. For that one moment, the world seemed to hold still between them. Then came the wind, roaring through the valley, carrying sparks that danced across the fields. Flames began to lick at the dry grass near the barn. The horses screamed from their stalls. She pulled her hand back, but the Apache held her gaze. "If you stay," he said quietly, "you will die with them." She looked toward the village where lights flickered and people shouted in confusion. Smoke rolled over the rooftops and the sound of cracking timber echoed through the night. Her heart pounded as she realized there was no time left to think. She could run with him into the wilderness, or stay and face the fire consuming everything she'd ever known. She wanted to believe the village would survive, that someone would come to save them. But the wind told another story. The Apache turned toward the open desert, the flames painting his figure in shifting orange light. Then, to her surprise, he paused again and extended his hand to her, the gesture quiet but commanding. In the distance, the sky glowed a deep, furious red. Ash began to fall like black snow. The woman stood frozen between the life she'd lived and the one she'd never imagined. Her breath shook as she looked at the hand reaching out to her, the hand of the man she'd freed, the one everyone called her enemy. Behind her, the barn began to collapse, sparks rising into the smoke-filled air. Ahead of her, the wilderness waited, silent and endless. The world was falling apart. The air burned with heat and fear. But somewhere beneath the roar of the fire and the screams from the village, there was something else. A heartbeat that didn't belong to one world or the other. And as the first wall of fire rolled across the plains, she took a single step forward, her fingers trembling above his. And in that moment, before their hands met, before the world burned to nothing, everything she thought she knew about love, war, and survival changed forever. The fire raged behind them like a living creature as they ran through the dark fields. Their shadows stretched long across the glowing ground. The woman stumbled once, her breath sharp and uneven, but the Apache turned back and caught her before she fell. His grip was strong, steady, and his voice, though quiet, carried through the chaos. "Keep moving," he said, his words rough but urgent. The sky above was filled with drifting ash, the air thick enough to taste. The old village, the only home she had ever known, was fading into a sea of fire behind them. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Every sound of collapsing wood or screaming cattle tore at her heart, but the only thing that mattered now was staying alive. They reached the dry creek bed that wound toward the hills, where the wind was cooler and the smoke less heavy. The Apache slowed his pace and turned to watch the horizon. His chest rose and fell with slow control, his eyes scanning the burning valley below. She sank to her knees, trembling, the lantern long lost somewhere in the field. The stars were barely visible through the haze, but their faint glimmer gave her a strange kind of hope. For the first time, she felt the vastness of the land, the same land that had both fed and divided them for generations. He watched her in silence for a long moment, then crouched nearby. "You were not meant to die there," he said finally. His voice carried no anger, only truth. She shook her head, still trying to steady her breath. "And you?" she asked softly. "You were meant to hang by sunrise." The words left her mouth before she could think. He didn't reply, but his eyes flickered toward the fire as if remembering something deeper than fear, something that had already burned long before tonight. The wind shifted again, bringing the distant cries of the townspeople and the crack of gunfire. He looked toward the ridge, where a faint glow revealed the path to the canyon. "They'll come this way soon," he said. "The soldiers, the ranchers, all of them. They'll think you ran with me." His words struck her like a blade. She hadn't thought that far. All she knew was that she couldn't let an innocent man die, but now the line between right and wrong seemed to vanish in the smoke. "Then what do we do?" she whispered. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We go where they won't follow." They traveled through the night, their steps silent on the dusty trail that twisted between jagged rocks and dry brush. Every sound, a snapping branch, a shifting stone, made her heart leap. The Apache moved like he was part of the land itself, guiding her through the shadows. Once, when she lagged behind, he offered his hand again, steady and sure. She hesitated before taking it, remembering how his touch had felt when the world burned. There was strength there, but also something else, a quiet resolve that seemed older than the war between their people. When dawn broke, the fire had shrunk to a black scar across the valley. They stopped near a ridge where a few mesquite trees clung to life, and he signaled for her to rest. The horizon glowed pale gold, and the first light touched his face, revealing the rough lines of exhaustion and old pain. He carried no weapon, only a small pouch tied at his side and a strip of cloth wrapped around his arm. She noticed the wound beneath it, the way his skin was darkened by dried blood. Without thinking, she reached for it. "You're hurt," she said. He drew back slightly, his eyes wary, but she persisted. "Let me help." He didn't speak, but after a moment he nodded. She tore a piece from her skirt and dipped it in water from her canteen, cleaning the wound as gently as she could. His breath stayed even, though his jaw tightened. "You don't owe me this," he murmured. "Maybe not," she replied quietly. "But I do it anyway." For a while neither said a word. The only sounds were the rustling of the wind and the soft call of distant birds returning after the storm. When she finished, he looked at her with a faint trace of something like gratitude, or maybe curiosity. "You're not like the others," he said at last. "They see my people as shadows to be chased away." She looked down at her hands stained with ash and blood. "Maybe I was like them once," she said. "But I've seen enough death. I just wanted it to stop." He studied her a moment longer, then turned his gaze toward the mountains. "The world doesn't stop for peace," he said. "It only pauses between storms." They moved again by midday, keeping to the dry ravines where the ground was cool. She asked him where they were going, but he didn't answer directly. "To a place where the land still remembers us," he said. "North of the ridge. You'll be safe there." She wasn't sure what he meant by safe, or why he still intended to protect her after everything, but she followed him anyway. Every few miles they passed the remains of old settlements, collapsed barns, wagon wheels buried in sand, and the bones of cattle left from years of drought. The land seemed to whisper its own story, one of greed and survival, of men who tried to tame it and failed. By afternoon, her strength began to fade. Her feet ached, her throat dry from dust. The Apache noticed and stopped near a small spring hidden beneath a rock shelf. He filled her canteen and handed it to her. "Drink slow," he said. She obeyed, the cool water burning her throat in the best way. She looked at him, wanting to ask his name, but something held her back. Maybe names belonged to another kind of world, the one that had burned away behind them. As they rested, she found herself studying him more closely. His skin bore faint scars, not just from war but from years of survival. His hair was tied loosely with a strip of leather, and his eyes, though calm, seemed to carry the weight of generations. She wondered what he had lost: family, tribe, home. "The fire," she said softly. "It wasn't just the wind, was it?" He turned his head slightly but didn't answer. "Did someone set it?" She pressed. He stood after a moment, his expression grave. "Men from the town wanted to drive my people from the valley. Burn the land, take the water. They call it justice." The truth struck her cold. All her life she'd heard talk of peace treaties and law, of order brought by settlers and soldiers. But now she saw that none of it mattered when greed was stronger than mercy. "So that's why they took you," she said. He looked at her, his voice quiet but heavy. "They took me because I wouldn't kneel." As evening fell again, they made camp in a shallow canyon where the air was still and cool. She built a small fire from dry twigs, its glow soft against the rock walls. He watched her work, his eyes reflecting the flames. For a long while they sat in silence. The crackling firelight danced between them, fragile and uncertain. She wanted to ask if his people were still alive, if they would take her in, or if this journey would end with both of them lost in the desert. But she didn't. She only said, "Do you think they'll come after us?" He nodded once. "They always come." Her heart sank, but there was something steady in his tone that made her believe he wasn't afraid. She looked toward the sky, where the stars returned one by one, clear and endless now that the smoke had faded. "If they find us," she said quietly, "they'll kill us both." He turned to her then, his face lit by the flicker of the fire. "Maybe," he said. "But until then we walk." The fire popped softly. She watched him as he closed his eyes, leaning back against the rock, his breathing slow and deep. For the first time since the flames consumed her home, she felt a strange calm settle over her. Not peace exactly, but the stillness that comes after running for too long. The air smelled of smoke and cedar, and though the world behind them had turned to ash, Something new was beginning in its place, a fragile bond, born from fire and fear. Yet even as she began to drift toward sleep, a sound rose from the distance, a single echo carried on the wind. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, then clearer. She opened her eyes, heart pounding, and looked to the Apache. He was already awake, his hand resting on the ground, feeling the vibration. He met her gaze, his voice low. "They've found the trail." The night fell silent except for the rhythm of approaching horses. The woman clutched her shawl, her pulse quickening as he rose to his feet, scanning the dark horizon. The wind carried the scent of smoke again, faint but familiar. It wasn't over. Not yet. And somewhere in the distance, the world that had fallen to ash was coming for them once more. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder as the night deepened, echoing through the canyon like a heartbeat of the land itself. The Apache stood motionless, listening with his head slightly tilted, every muscle coiled with instinct. The woman could barely breathe. Her hands trembled as she clutched the worn edge of her shawl, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. She had thought they'd escaped, but the world behind them had long arms and iron determination. The soldiers or the ranchers were coming. He motioned for her to put out the fire. She scattered the embers with a branch until only faint sparks remained, the darkness swallowing them whole. He moved silently toward the edge of the canyon and crouched low, peering out toward the open desert where the faint glow of torches flickered like ghost lights. "They've split," he whispered. "One group to the ridge, one down the creek. They'll trap us between them." His calmness frightened her more than panic ever could. She wanted to ask how he knew their movements, but the answer was already written in his eyes. He had lived his life watching the enemy move across the land like a tide, learning the rhythm of their fear and their arrogance. "Can we hide?" she whispered. He shook his head slowly. "Not for long. But there's a pass through the rocks ahead, narrow and steep. They'll think no one would risk it at night." They gathered their few belongings, and he guided her through the darkness, his steps sure even when the ground turned rough. The moon rose thin and sharp above the canyon walls, casting pale light over the jagged rocks. She stumbled often, her boots slipping on loose gravel. But he was always there, steadying her without a word. Once, as they paused to listen, she caught a glimpse of the riders below, 5 of them, their torches swaying, rifles glinting faintly. They were searching not for justice but for revenge. As they climbed higher, the woman's thoughts turned inward. She remembered the faces of the people she'd grown up with, the baker's wife, the preacher's sons, the old woman who sold candles in front of the church. They were the ones now hunting her, believing she'd turned against her own. The thought hollowed her from the inside. "They'll never forgive me," she whispered. The Apache didn't turn, but his voice came soft against the wind. Forgiveness is a word men use when they fear truth. By dawn, the two reached the upper pass, a narrow ledge cut through sandstone cliffs, with the valley stretching out far below. From there, the village was no more than a faint scar of smoke in the distance. The woman leaned against the rock, her breath shallow. The Apache scanned the horizon. "We'll rest here until the sun rises," he said. She nodded, though her mind was far from rest. Every step deeper into the wilderness seemed to erase another piece of the life she'd known. When the light came, golden and sharp, it revealed the desolation of the land. Hills rolled endlessly toward the horizon, dotted with dry brush and silent stones. The air was still, too still. She noticed the Apache watching the sky, his expression thoughtful. "You think they'll keep chasing us?" she asked. He nodded once. "Until they have proof we're dead." His words carried no emotion, just certainty. They followed the ridge until midday, then descended toward a dry basin where old cottonwood stood beside a trickle of water. There he stopped and knelt beside the stream, touching the earth with his fingers. "This place remembers," he said. She didn't understand, but she knelt beside him, feeling the cool dirt beneath her hands. He looked up toward the cliffs. "My people used to travel through here in the spring. There was a village once. It burned long before yours did." The memory hung between them like dust in sunlight. She saw for the first time the depth of his loss, not just one night of fire, but years of it, scattered across the land. "Was it soldiers?" she asked quietly. He nodded, still gazing at the distant hills. "They came after the gold. They said the land was empty, but it was full of our father's bones." His tone was calm, almost too calm, and that calmness broke something in her heart. They rested in the basin through the heat of the day. He gathered dried roots and crushed them with his hands, mixing them with water to treat his arm. She watched the precision of his movements, the quiet patience of a man who had learned survival from the earth itself. When she asked if he would ever go back to his tribe, he hesitated. "If any are left," he said. "Maybe they've gone north. Maybe they're ghosts now." His eyes drifted toward the horizon again, distant and full of sorrow. As the afternoon faded, another sound reached them, the sharp cry of a hawk circling above. The Apache rose, following its path with his eyes. "Scouts," he said under his breath. "They're close." He motioned for her to stay low and moved toward a rocky ledge, vanishing into the brush like smoke. The minutes that followed stretched endlessly. Every whisper of wind made her heart jump. When he returned, his expression was grim. "3 men," he said. "On horses. They're tracking our prints." They packed quickly, moving through the brush along the creek bed. The woman's pulse hammered in her chest. "We can't outrun horses," she said. He glanced at her, his tone calm but firm. "We won't. We'll vanish." He led her toward a cave half hidden behind a curtain of vines and slipped inside. The air was cool and damp, smelling of stone and old water. They crouched near the entrance, silent. The hoofbeats drew closer, the sound of metal and leather filling the air. She could see the silhouettes of riders passing by the creek, rifles at their sides, faces hard under their wide-brimmed hats. Her body tensed with every heartbeat, afraid that one glance, one stray sound would betray them. The Apache sat beside her, still and patient as a statue. He didn't move until the riders faded into the distance. When at last the sound was gone, she exhaled the breath she'd been holding. "They'll come back," she said quietly. "They always come back." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then we keep moving," he said. They stayed hidden until nightfall, and when they emerged, the stars blazed brighter than she had ever seen. The desert stretched wide and endless, the silence both haunting and beautiful. They walked again under the moonlight, their shadows long against the sand. Somewhere far behind them, a gunshot echoed, faint but sharp. Neither spoke, but both knew it meant the hunt hadn't stopped. By the 3rd day, exhaustion began to take its toll. The woman's feet were blistered, her clothes torn, and her voice hoarse from thirst. Still, she followed, driven by something she didn't yet understand. Each mile carried them deeper into a land untouched by men, strange rock towers, dry riverbeds, and the bones of long-dead cattle bleaching in the sun. The silence grew heavier, pressing on them both. That evening they reached a plateau overlooking a narrow valley where a few wild horses grazed among the brush. The sight of life brought a faint smile to her face. "They don't seem afraid," she said. He watched them with a faint, wistful look. "They've never known chains." She turned to him, sensing the bitterness behind his words. "And you?" she asked. "Have you?" He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something raw. Anger. Maybe grief. "Every man does," he said quietly. "Some chains are made of iron, some of blood." The words stayed with her long after the sun disappeared. They camped beneath a rock overhang, the stars sharp and cold above them. As she lay awake, she thought of the village, of the people she had once called family, and of the man now sitting a few feet away, silent and alert. Somewhere deep inside, she realized the line between them, the one drawn by fear, war, and rumor, was beginning to fade. But just as that thought formed, a distant voice shattered the quiet. It came from the valley below, a shout followed by the crack of a rifle. The horses scattered, and another voice answered, closer this time. The Apache was already on his feet, his silhouette outlined against the stars. "They found us," he said, her blood turned cold. The sound of boots and hooves echoed through the rocks, growing louder by the second. The Apache turned to her, his tone urgent but steady. "Go up the ridge, stay low. Don't stop until you see the river." She shook her head, fear rising in her throat. "I'm not leaving you." He met her eyes, calm but fierce. "You must." The shouts grew nearer. The smell of gunpowder drifted through the wind. She hesitated, torn between terror and trust. Then, before she could speak, he pressed something into her hand, a small charm made of woven thread and bone. "If you live," he said, "the world may remember truth through you." Then he turned toward the darkness, vanishing into it as the first gunshots lit the valley below. The woman clutched the charm, her heart breaking as she ran toward the ridge, the echoes of fire and pursuit chasing her into the night. The conflict that had burned through land and blood now burned through her soul, and she knew the world of peace she once dreamed of was far beyond reach. The wilderness had claimed them both, and its judgment was only beginning. The moon had sunk behind the cliffs when she reached the ridge. Her lungs burned, and every breath came with the taste of dust and smoke. Below her, the valley was alive with flickering torches, shadows of horsemen sweeping through the brush like wolves closing in on prey. The woman pressed herself against the rocks, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Somewhere down there, the Apache was still fighting, or running. She couldn't tell. Every gunshot made her flinch. Every echo of shouting twisted her stomach tighter. The small charm he had given her still rested in her palm, warm from her grip. She didn't know what it meant, only that it felt like the last piece of him she could hold on to. She crawled higher, her fingers scraping against the stone. From the crest, she could see the desert spread wide and endless, bathed in silver light. The river glimmered faintly to the east, its winding line the only sign of direction in the emptiness. He had told her to run to it, but every instinct pulled her back toward the sound of battle below. The thought of leaving him, after everything he had lost, after everything she had done, gnawed at her heart. She tried to steady herself, whispering into the cold air, "He'll find me. He has to." But even her voice seemed small against the vast silence. A sudden flash split the dark, a rifle muzzle. Then another. The echoes rolled through the canyon. She turned, unable to stop herself, and saw figures moving near the stream bed. The Apache was among them, his form unmistakable even at a distance. He moved quickly, darting between shadows, his steps sure and silent. The men chasing him fired wildly, cursing into the wind. One torch fell, igniting dry grass that flared up in a rush of flame. The fire spread fast, painting the night in shades of orange and red. The woman's breath caught. She wanted to scream, to warn him, but the sound died in her throat. Instead, she began climbing down, her hands and knees raw from the stone. The slope was steep, and loose gravel sent her sliding several feet at a time. Still, she pushed forward. The wind carried the scent of smoke again, thick and bitter. The same fire that had destroyed her village now threatened to swallow the canyon. It felt like the land itself was punishing them both for trying to survive. When she reached the bottom, she crouched behind a fallen log and peered through the haze. The Apache was no longer in sight, but the men were closer now. 4 of them, rifles raised, their voices sharp with anger. "Fan out!" one shouted. He can't have gone far. Their accents were rough, their movements practiced. These weren't just ranchers. They were hired guns, the kind the rich men from the east sent west when they wanted the law done in silence. She stayed low, clutching the charm against her chest. Every part of her body screamed to run, but her heart refused. The gunfire stopped. The men grew quiet, listening. One of them bent down near the creek, studying the ground. "Tracks," he said. 2 sets. One's lighter, smaller. The words froze her blood. They knew she was with him. The leader raised his head, scanning the darkness. "The woman's alive. Find her too." She turned and crept toward the deeper brush, each step careful, each breath held. The branches tore at her skirt, but she kept moving, guided by the faint sound of running water. The river couldn't be far now. The moon broke through the clouds again, giving just enough light to reveal the narrow trail ahead. Her heart pounded with both hope and dread. Then, movement. A shadow stepped from behind a boulder, and she stopped dead in her tracks. It was him, the Apache. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, his eyes sharp even in the dim light. He motioned for silence and gestured for her to follow. Without a word, she did. They moved swiftly through the brush, away from the voices that still called her name. When they finally stopped beneath a low overhang of rock, he turned to her, his breathing steady but heavy. "They know you're here," he said. She nodded, her throat too dry to answer. He looked toward the horizon where the faint glow of the fire still burned. "The river's close," he said. "If we reach it before sunrise, we can cross into the highlands. They won't follow there." She wanted to believe him, but the fear in her chest wouldn't ease. "They'll keep coming," she whispered. "They won't stop." He met her eyes, his voice low but firm. "Then neither will we." They walked through the night, each step harder than the last. The ground grew softer as they neared the riverbed, and the sound of running water filled the air like a song from another world. But with it came another sound, the creak of leather and the distant jingle of spurs. The riders were splitting again, closing the distance. The Apache stopped, crouching low, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "They're circling ahead," he said. "They want to push us toward the open ground." The woman's heart raced. "What do we do?" she asked. He scanned the shadows and pointed toward a rocky bluff overlooking the water. "Up there," he said. "We hold the high ground." She followed him without question, climbing the slope as quietly as she could. The view from above revealed the dark ribbon of the river and the faint shapes of riders moving like phantoms through the mist. The tension in the air was unbearable, the silence so thick it felt alive. He handed her a small stone knife from his belt. "If they reach you," he said, "don't run. Fight." She stared at it, her hand shaking. "I don't know how." His gaze was steady. "Then survive." The first shot came from below. The echo cracked through the night, followed by shouting. Sparks burst from a rifle near the creek, and a bullet whined past the rock where they hid. The Apache ducked and returned fire with a revolver taken from one of his captors days before. The sound of metal against stone rang out as bullets struck the bluff. The woman covered her ears, her body pressed tight to the earth. The chaos below was unreal. Shouting, gunfire, horses screaming in panic. The world had turned into a storm of light and sound. Then, through the smoke, she saw one of the riders break away and climb toward them. The Apache stood reloading quickly. "Stay down," he ordered. But the man was fast, cutting through the rocks with practiced ease. The woman grabbed the knife, her breath ragged. When the attacker reached the ledge, the Apache swung first, knocking the man backward with a hard blow. The rifle slipped from the attacker's hands and fell into the ravine. They struggled briefly, both moving with the desperate strength of men who had run out of choices. The woman wanted to help but froze, unable to move. The clash of bodies, the grunts of pain, it was too much. Then the Apache forced the man against the rock wall, disarming him. "Go," he hissed. "Get to the river." She hesitated, torn between running and staying, but his voice rose sharper now, commanding. "Go," she ran. The sound of the fight faded behind her, replaced by the pounding of her own heartbeat. The river shimmered ahead, its current fast and cold under the moonlight. She stumbled to the edge, gasping for air. The bank was steep, the water deep. Behind her, the shots continued, echoing through the canyon. She turned, searching the darkness for him. Then she saw him, emerging from the rocks, moving fast, his breath heavy. But another shadow followed. The last of the riders had spotted him, raising his rifle. The woman screamed his name, though she wasn't sure if he heard it. The gun fired, the flash blinding against the dark. The Apache staggered but kept moving, his hand pressed to his side. He didn't fall, not yet. He reached her at the riverbank, his face pale in the moonlight. "Go," he said again, his voice barely a whisper. She shook her head, tears cutting through the dirt on her cheeks. "Not without you." His eyes softened just enough to show something between gratitude and sorrow. The water roared beside them, wild and merciless. The riders were closing in again, their torches flickering along the ridge, their shouts filling the night. The Apache took her hand, his grip firm despite the blood darkening his shirt. "Listen," he said. "What happens next? You must not look back." His gaze held hers for a long moment, the weight of it stronger than any promise. The world around them seemed to fade, the firelight, the gunfire, even the sound of the river. All that remained was the space between them, alive with everything they couldn't say. Then from the darkness came another crack of gunfire. The bullet struck the water near their feet, sending up a spray of mist. The Apache turned, pulling her close, and for an instant the two stood together at the edge of the rushing river, the flames of pursuit closing in behind them, the wild unknown stretching ahead. The night trembled with the weight of everything that was about to happen, and as the wind rose, carrying the scent of smoke and fear, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final choice that would decide whether they lived or vanished into legend. The wind howled across the canyon, carrying sparks from the burning ridges above. The Apache's grip tightened around her hand, his breath shallow but unbroken. Behind them, the riders shouted orders, their torches spreading light across the stones like searchlights of vengeance. There was no time left. The river roared at their feet, wild and deep, its current pulling with the same relentless force that had pulled both their lives toward this moment. He looked at her one last time, eyes steady even through the pain. "Now," he said quietly, and together they stepped into the dark water. The current caught them instantly, dragging them under the cold surface. For a heartbeat there was only silence and rushing weight, the sound of her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She fought to stay near him, reaching through the water until her fingers brushed his arm. They surfaced downstream, gasping, the river carrying them between jagged rocks and branches. The world was a blur of foam and moonlight. She clung to him as the current finally slowed, washing them onto a sandy bend lined with willows. For a moment neither moved. The only sound was the rush of water fading into the distance. She turned to him, shaking, her dress heavy with river mud. He was lying still beside her, his face pale, his hand pressed against his side where the blood had soaked through his shirt. Panic gripped her as she pressed her hand there too, trying to stop it. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Please." His eyes fluttered open, calm even in pain. "We made it," he murmured. She looked around them. The far side of the river, silent and untouched by the fire. They had crossed into the wild lands, the ones settlers called cursed and empty. To her it felt like a sanctuary. She tore a piece from her dress and wrapped it tightly around his wound. He didn't protest, only watched her with a strange, tired peace. "You shouldn't have come back for me," he said. "If you had gone alone, you'd be safe now." She shook her head fiercely. "I wouldn't have been safe anywhere knowing you were still fighting out there." Her voice cracked under the weight of exhaustion and emotion. "You saved me." "Let me save you." For a while, neither spoke. The dawn began to bloom in the east, soft pink spreading across the sky, painting the desert in light. It was the first sunrise she'd seen since her village burned, and for the first time it didn't feel like loss. It felt like a beginning. The Apache tried to sit, but she stopped him. "Rest," she said. He nodded weakly. "There's a cave up the ridge. Water and roots there. I know the place." His voice was fading, but his will was strong. Together they rose and began the slow climb. Each step was a test of endurance. She supported him as best she could, his arm draped over her shoulders, her feet sinking in the soft sand. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun was high and the air heavy with heat. Inside the cave, cool and quiet, she laid him down and tended his wound again, using herbs he guided her to find among the rocks. He spoke little, only enough to help her help him. Days passed that way, time marked by light through the cave mouth, the cry of hawks above, and the slow healing of his strength. During those quiet days, she learned more about him, not through stories but through small glimpses. How he watched the land like it was alive, how he whispered thanks before drinking water, how he still carried a piece of painted cloth from his village that had burned long before hers. When he spoke of it, his voice softened. "My mother wove this," he said one evening as the sun bled across the rocks. "She said it carries the memory of the land. Even fire can't take that." The woman listened, the words sinking deep into her heart. She began to gather berries, find wood, and learn how to live the way he did. Quietly, respectfully, with care. The land, once a thing to be feared, became their protector. The men who had chased them never came across the river. She sometimes saw smoke in the distance and wondered if it was the last of the searchers or the new settlers marking territory, but she never saw torches again. The world on that side seemed to forget them, and she was grateful. As weeks passed, the Apache's strength returned, though his steps were slower, his breath shorter. He spoke little about what would come next. One evening, as the wind carried the scent of rain, she asked him, "Will you go north to find your people?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Maybe," he said, "but the land is wide, and ghosts don't leave tracks." She understood then that his tribe might be gone, scattered or lost to history. And she knew she couldn't send him into that emptiness alone. The storm came that night, one of those desert rains that turn silence into thunder. They huddled at the cave's entrance, watching the lightning dance across the sky. The air smelled of earth and life. She felt his hand rest over hers, warm and steady. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. She turned to him. "Freeing you?" He nodded. She shook her head. "No. If I hadn't, I'd still be living behind walls, believing lies about the world. Maybe it burned for a reason." His gaze lingered on her, something like understanding passing between them. When the rain ended, the desert bloomed. The dry ground turned green for a few brief days, and the sound of birds filled the canyon again. They walked together through the grass, barefoot, silent except for the rhythm of the river nearby. It felt unreal, as if the land itself was giving them one last moment of peace before the world found them again. She could see it in his eyes, that he knew this peace couldn't last. By the next week, the signs of movement appeared again, hoofprints by the far bank, faint smoke on the horizon. The riders hadn't forgotten after all. She saw the worry in his face, though he said nothing. That night, he stayed awake long after she slept, watching the stars, tracing constellations only his people still remembered. When she woke, he was gone. Panic shot through her as she ran outside, calling his name. She found him by the river, standing tall, his figure reflected in the pale light of dawn. "They're coming again," he said quietly. "I can lead them away." "You'll stay here where they won't find you." She shook her head in disbelief. "You can't face them alone." His expression softened, but there was no fear in it. "I was born in this land. It knows me. It's not me they want, it's the story of what we did. If they take me, they'll stop hunting you." Her throat tightened. "No, she whispered. You can't ask me to let you go. He stepped closer, his voice calm. You gave me freedom once. Let me give it back. The words broke her heart, but she saw truth in them. He brushed his fingers against hers, leaving the small woven charm in her palm again. Keep this, he said. It remembers. And before she could speak, he turned toward the desert and walked into the rising sun. She watched until his figure disappeared beyond the horizon, swallowed by the heat and light. The wind rose behind him, scattering dust like ash. She didn't know if he lived or died after that, only that the search parties never returned and the world stayed quiet. Years passed. The land healed. Grass grew where fire had once burned. A small settlement rose near the river again, though this time it was built by people who listened to the land rather than tried to own it. The woman lived on its edge, older now, her hair streaked with silver, her heart steady. She told no one her full story. Only small pieces, the fire, the crossing, the man who taught her what it meant to be free. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the south, she would hear a hawk's cry echo over the hills, and she'd look toward the mountains, wondering if somewhere out there, he was still walking beneath the same sky. And when travelers passed through and asked about the strange charm hanging in her window, a circle of woven thread and bone, she only smiled and said it was a reminder that once, long ago, when the world fell to ash, two souls crossed the fire together and found that freedom was not given by men or nations, but by the courage to reach for another hand when everything else was burning. And in the quiet that followed, she would close her eyes and feel the warmth of that long-ago sunrise, the one that promised that even in ruin, the heart could still begin again.